So thanks, Colton. So Luke 24, the resurrection of Jesus. Well, one of the things that's just incredible about the women and the response of the disciples is that they just don't get it. That of course they should have expected Jesus to have been alive after 3 days. He said, I'm going to be captured, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be crucified, and after 3 days I'll rise again. And yet they totally don't get it. The women come to anoint the body. They see that, the angels meet them and tell them he's alive, and yet they still seem to question it. These two on the way to Emmaus, they complain that, yeah, we'd really hoped it was him who would redeem Israel, but now it's the 3rd day since all this happened. Thinking, wakey, guys, it's the 3rd day. This is exactly when you should be expecting him to have risen. And you're complaining that, he's been dead for 3 days now. It's all hopeless. And I think what you learn from that is that you can read or hear the most basic, obvious statements. Like they had heard these statements from Jesus, and yet just not get it. When it's not that it's hard to understand. He said so many times, I will die, be crucified, after 3 days I'll rise again. And then 3 days afterwards, they're like, oh, well, it's already 3 days. This is hopeless. And even when the women came and said, yeah, we've seen him, they say, this is idle talk, verse 11. Literally, this is craziness. You're mad. You're mental. You're just tripping out. This is absolute nonsense. What do you mean? He's risen from the dead. And we have to be aware that we have the same human nature. We have that same tendency to not see the obvious. It's not that we sort of intellectually can't get it. The most simple reality is that Jesus died, rose again, is now in heaven, will come back to the earth. If we believe into him, baptized, live in Christ, we really will live forever. It's not rocket science. It's so simple. But we want to make it more difficult. And I think the women tended to do this. In verse 23, they came saying that they'd seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. No, they had actually met real angels. Not a vision of angels. They had seen real angels, and Jesus himself had met them, if you compare this with the other Gospels. But instead they make it all a bit more complicated. Well, we saw a vision. Yeah, could have been true, could have not been. Might have been figurative. Because the simple reality was too much for them. And so the simple reality that we really will live forever, that this life is not all, that we shall rise from the grave, all our sins are actually not barriers to the love of God, all our dysfunction, all our weakness, all the stuff we don't get, all that is fixed. All that is sorted out. This is the most simple, basic message. And yet we make it all complicated. Maybe it's a vision, maybe it's symbolic, maybe it means this. Well, I don't know, who knows? Because I suppose why we do that, subconsciously, is that it demands everything. If actually I know that I'm going to live forever, well, this is not a hobby. This is not a Sunday club. This is not, just a hobby. You pick up a Bible now and again because it's sort of interesting, like you might pick up your favourite author and have a read of it. This demands every atom of our being. That, wow, I'm going to live forever. Wow, this life is just a few millimetres at the beginning of an endless line, of an endless life that I'll receive when Jesus comes back. Wow, this demands everything from us. And so therefore I think we try to make it a little bit more complicated than it is, because it sort of excuses our lack of faith. And so you then ask, well, who wrote these gospel records? Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Well, of course, God wrote them through inspiration, but humanly speaking, these gospel records arose because this was how, for example, Luke used to preach, or how Matthew used to preach. And they all tend to start where we would, which is with the promises to Abraham, and they conclude, as Luke does here, with an appeal for baptism. And so over the years, as Matthew or Mark or Luke or John kept on preaching the same thing, well, it was written down, it was transcribed, a record was made of it, under inspiration. So this, for example, Gospel of Luke, this is the good news that Luke talked to people. And yet he keeps on, all of them do the same, Matthew, Mark and John as well, they keep on emphasising about how dumb the disciples were. But who's talking here? It's the disciples. And I think what they're saying is, look everybody, we were so stupid, we were so slow to believe all this. You believe it. Please, can you believe it? Don't be like us, who were so stupid and so slow. And that, I think, has the ring of credibility to it. That is where we are likely to succeed in preaching the gospel if we totally admit our own weakness. If we come over as arrogant and having all the questions answered and we know it all, and we're here to give information to you who are ignorant, now people don't want that. They're far more likely to respond as someone who's more real the more credible, someone who's not perfect, someone who's admitting they got mistakes. As you probably know, over the years, Cindy and I have been used by God to build up a very large ecclesia or church in Riga. But it wasn't really our work. It was baptizing people who then went and told other people. And it was like network marketing. And some of those people who baptized, they must have brought 10, 20 people or even more to baptism. And you know what? The most successful preachers amongst them, they were all smokers. A lot of them. And why were they successful? Because people didn't feel threatened. You know, the bloke's got a cigarette in his hand while he's telling me that I need to get baptized. The more real, the more credible. Now, I'm not suggesting we all just light up and, that's the way to do it kind of thing. But what I'm saying is that these gospel records are an admission of the writer's own weakness, that we were so stupid, we didn't get it big time. And so that's why it was attractive. So these two are going on their journey back to Emmaus. It says 60 furlongs. It would have taken a couple of hours, about a 2-hour walk. And then Jesus himself, 15, draws near and goes with them. But their eyes were kept from recognising him. Well, you might think, well, why then does Jesus get cranky with them when he says, well, why, you fools to have not understood it was me? Well, I think it shows that if you don't want to understand something, then your eyes will be shut even more. And if you do want to understand, your eyes will be opened. Now, if we want to go the way of God to his kingdom and we're praying, God, please open my eyes, show me the way, he will. If we don't care about it and don't really want to get there anyway, our eyes will be closed. And Jesus says to them, why, what are you talking about? And they said, verse 18, do you live alone in Jerusalem? And is that why you don't understand what happened there recently? Verse 18. Well, in first century society, it was normal that people lived in family, that people lived in some sort of community. It was unusual that anyone lived alone. In our society, a lot of people live alone. It's quite normal to live on your own, especially when you're younger, live in a flat or whatever. But for them, and it's the same in a lot of like Middle East today, a lot of people would not accept that. You don't live alone. You must live with relatives or your family. You must live with somebody. And the only people who don't live with other people are people who are a bit odd. People who've messed up in their lives, people who are maybe a little bit mentally challenged, people who are thought to be unclean, people who are thought to be odd. They're the odd ones who live alone. And so when they say to him in 18, is it because you live alone in Jerusalem that you don't know what we're talking about? In other words, are you so cut off from society that you don't know what we're talking about? So Jesus came over to them as a very ordinary bloke, a bit mixed up. That he's a bit odd, this guy, He seems to be the sort of fellow who just lives on his own, hasn't got a family. And in their first century context, that made you very odd. So they thought, yeah, this guy lives on his own, and that's why he doesn't know what's been going on. Just saying how human Jesus really was, how he came over with no air of arrogance or superiority. It's why when he stood up in the synagogue when he was 30 years old and basically said, guys, I'm Messiah, they were like, you can't be, we know you. You're just an ordinary fella, you're the carpenter's son. And I think that's just wonderful. It really proves Jesus is not God, that he's the Son of God and not God but human. And it also says a lot about the beauty of his nature, of how he was as a person. That he could live for 30 years, never sinning, because Jesus never sinned. That means he never omitted to do anything that he should have done. He didn't commit any sin, he didn't omit to do anything. He was absolutely perfect, but no one noticed. And when he basically said, well, this day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears, that I am Messiah, they were like, you? You're just an ordinary bloke. Who do you think you are? And I really respect that about him, that he didn't come over as superior in any way. So, he talks to them and explains the scriptures to them. And then verse 28, they drew near to Emmaus where they were going, and he made out as if he would go further. And they said, oh, stop, no, please, you must stay the night. And that's not the first time he acted like that. You remember when there was a storm on the lake and they were all pretty well drowning, and he's walking on the water and he makes as if he's going to walk past them and say, oh, Jesus, please come. So, oh, okay, you need me, do you? Okay, yeah, I'll just come over. What's your problem, guys? Oh, you're drowning. Okay. Another example. Jesus apparently was asleep in the other storm on the lake on a pillow, and they woke him up and said, why don't you wake up and save us? We're dying. Well, I wonder if he was really asleep, or whether he was, as here, just not playing hard to get, but, well, as it says, making as if he was going to go further to sort of pique their desire, so that they would say, yeah, no, please come in. And this is why I think there is this silence of God in our lives, that sometimes you really want an answer, and God doesn't give it, and Jesus Christ isn't there, and God apparently doesn't come through for you. Or he appears to be there, but going someplace else. And I think this is to make us cry out in real faith. Please come into my life. So he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them, 30. And I think that's clear evidence that the breaking of bread, as it was practiced in the first century, was having a meal together. To break your bread with each other was to share a meal. Because it's exactly the same words about the breaking of bread. He blessed, broke, and gave it to them. And it says in verse 35, he was known to them by the breaking of bread. It's as if his special presence is mediated through the breaking of bread, and we're going to do that right now. And when they saw how he broke bread with them, it was then their eyes were opened. They thought, this is Jesus. I suggest that his body language, his mannerisms, the way he looked as he broke that bread, was how he looked when he had broken bread with them in the upper room and all the times previously when he'd broken bread. But now he was risen. So the characteristics and the body language of the risen Jesus were the same as those that he had used before. And as Paul says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. So the Jesus who loved little children, the Jesus who hated Pharisees and Pharisaism, the Jesus who just wanted to save people at any cost, even the cost of his own life, that Jesus is the same today as he was yesterday, and this is the Jesus we will meet at the day of judgment. This is who he will always be. It's not as if he showed this nice, kind face to little kiddies when he was on earth, but then when he comes back, he's going to come back like some mad, cranky, angry man. He's not. He's the same Jesus. And it's the same with us, that really, although we shall be changed, it is also true that we will essentially be who we are, because it's Duncan who's going to be saved. It's Louise. It's whoever. It's us as the sum of all our personality, all our human experience. Salvation is personal. I shall be saved. You shall be saved. And that just points up the critical importance of who we are, of the character that we develop. And he shows them his hands and his feet, obviously the marks in the hands and feet where the nails had been. Well, they thought they'd seen a ghost. They believed, in their weak moment, in an immortal soul, which we know is not right. So it just shows that faith is not absolute in anybody, and that people go back to old beliefs. But he doesn't, Jesus didn't say, you think I'm a ghost? You believe in the immortal soul? Right, see you later. I'm out with you guys. He does correct them. He says, look at my hands and my feet. I'm not a ghost. But all the way through, he accepts them. Well, I want to conclude with verse 50 and 51, that he leads them out to Bethany. He lifts up his hands and blesses them. Well, that is the priestly blessing. When that the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you. And so that was his sort of parting goodbye to his people, that I bless you, as it were. Now, we often think that Jesus ascended to heaven from the Mount of Olives. But I want to just leave you to something to chew on. It says here that he ascended from Bethany. Now, Bethany and the Mount of Olives are two different locations, a few miles away from each other. And I think putting the gospel records together with what you got in Acts chapter 1, he went to Bethany, and who was at Bethany? His best friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, where him and the disciples were used to sleeping and were used to going. It was, if you like, a house church. He goes there, they have a meal, you could call it a breaking of bread. He blesses them, he raises his hands, and he ascends to heaven from the church, from the house church in Bethany. And then in Acts 1, you've got this thing about the Mount of Olives, that the disciples are on the Mount of Olives. The disciples go from Bethany to the Mount of Olives, which was the highest sort of area, the highest spot around there, and they're looking up to heaven. And two angels appear and say, this Jesus who's gone up there is going to come back. In other words, he ascended not from the Mount of Olives, but from Bethany. And they go to the Mount of Olives afterwards. Like, where's he gone? Let's see if we can get as close to him as we can. Or there's a mountain there. Or it's just a big hill, really. Let's go up the top of the hill, see if we can see him. That's my take. Now, if that is so, that has huge relevance to our little house church here, that there is Jesus. He left from a house church, lifting up his hands in absolute blessing. And that is what he wants to do. He loves blessing. He loves being kind. He loves saving. He loves forgiving. It's not that he does it grudgingly if we grovel enough. He loves doing this. And this is that same Jesus with whom we have to do. And we're now going to break bread exactly in that same spirit.